Welcome to the Lost Vet Podcast, where we are helping you to get back to your passion and purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Melodie Chan, and in this episode of Destination People, I have Jodi Lynch Finley with us to help walk through a scenario where we have a Millennial Associate Veterinarian who is feeling like they can't get any changes done that they would like to have done with a decision maker, Gen Xer veterinarian within the clinic. Have a listen. Jodi, I am excited to have you back on the pod.
I'm so excited to be here. This is so fun. I just love having these conversations with you, Melodie.
Yeah. So I wanted to build a little bit on our last conversation where we went through the different generations in the workplace. And if you haven't heard that one, you can go and look for that one for generations. And actually, I thought it'd be helpful for our listeners if we actually walked through a real life scenario and to see if they could maybe see themselves in it, or maybe it's something that they're dealing with right now. How does that sound?
Perfect. Fire away.
Good. So this is a scenario, like I've heard variations of this various times in different ways, but let's go specifically. I know of a millennial veterinary associate that's in a practice. They've been there for just over 2 years. And one of the other veterinarians that they work with quite closely in there, who is also a decision maker, who can help influence protocols, just the way the workflow goes during the day. The veterinarian they're working with would fall into the Gen-X category. And so the conflict or challenge that I've heard from this millennial vet is that this person is just not feeling heard. They're really trying to implement trying a new way of doing something as far as sort of patient intake and flow through from intake to discharge through the hospital, and just feeling like they're not being heard and getting really frustrated with this Gen X decision maker. So if that millennial veterinarian was coming up to you, how would you guide them, if you will?
Melodie, this is a question we face every day, really every day. And so, as you mentioned, we talked through the generations in our previous episode, and that was really a fun one. But just for our listeners' sake, a millennial was born between 1981 and 1996 or thereabouts, right? Don't get too hung up on the beginning and end years, but for the most part, that is where our millennials fall. And then you mentioned Gen X. And that is that's you and I. We determined that, right? But born between 1965 and 1980. So it's a pretty small generation that actually doesn't get talked about a lot. And so I think that's important for our listeners to really understand. A little bit of a definition on Gen X is that we are considered the least nurtured generation. So that when we really start to talk about that, if we have some of these understandings, it starts to influence our ability to communicate across a multi-generational workplace. So in the scenario, Melodie, that you set up, it is that millennial associate veterinarian who is not feeling what I call seen, heard, and understood, which is really a very basic need for each and every one of us. Doesn't matter who we are, doesn't matter what generation or what gender or anything. We all want to be seen, we want to be heard, and we want to be understood. And that in lies the problem in most of today's workplace conflict is failure to communicate. When it really comes down to it, it's just failure to communicate. So, there's a lot of different ways that we can look at a challenge like that. And I tend to ask a lot of questions. That would be my job. If I was in any capacity trying to help support them in a coaching fashion, my job, right, is to ask more questions. And I've spent a lot of my career focused on professional development in a way that helps support people. We can, Melodie, like we know that we have a standard of excellence second to none when it comes to academic knowledge and clinical education. And if you think about academic knowledge and clinical and technical education as the two top pieces of a triangle, and that the foundation of that triangle is people, it's
Mm-hmm.
communication, it's the human aspect of how we work. We cannot utilize our academic knowledge and clinical and technical skills effectively without a foundation that allows us to communicate and collaborate with the people who we are working with and for. So I tend to set it up in that way. And, oftentimes, especially in our veterinary industry and animal health, it helps us to think about it from that perspective. And to know that if I am a millennial veterinarian who's not feeling seen, heard, or understood, what can I do to have a courageous conversation with this person that I may work for, or at least has authority over me in some way? And, I think that our ability to ask ourselves what our objective is. I want to have some autonomy. I want to be able to grow my skills. Does it come back to our desire to become a more effective and efficient personal and professional, right? Am I trying to be a more effective and efficient professional? Am I trying to be more effective and efficient person in general? And if you go into it with that foundation, then oftentimes those conversations can be less combative, right? Where if you can get their time, sometimes that's the biggest challenge of all. Is that leader willing to give you the time, not while you're hurrying down the hallway to your next appointment, but often I encourage that conversation to be had outside of clinic doors, right? At least outside of clinic hours. I want us to have a greater opportunity to have conversations, communications, and collaborations with the people that we work for and with, that we are fully present. We have to be able to have some level of basic vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And in today's hustle culture, that is sometimes almost non-existent. And that's the real challenge. So do I feel that I can prepare myself well enough to ask that person? And, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And you've mentioned before, we talk a lot about above the line behavior and below the line behavior. Yeah. Above the line behavior is accountability. Below the line behavior has excuses, and blame. And so Are we going to blame that Gen X leader? Are we going to use excuses that, well, he's a 50-year-old white man and he's not listening to me? I'm not afraid to have some of those conversations. And I'll be the first to say that in the really productive environments that we get to work in, it is because most often they bring in someone who is willing to have these conversations, right? It's an outside coach. It's someone like Rob Marr, who comes in and is able to really drive some of those kinds of conversations that allow us to look ourselves in the mirror and really start to say, okay, yes, I am a Gen X, so I feel like I'm driving towards efficiency at all times. I feel very confident in who I am, what I do, why I do what I do, and when I do what I do. So here's the way we're going to do it. Moving on, right? Sound familiar?
Oh my gosh, you're saying all that. I'm like, wow, Jodi's in my head. Now I'm listening to this going, wow, yep, this is how I'm perceived.
Yes. And then, maybe this millennial associate, we have two, and one of them is very much like us. And so It works. And then we have one who is constantly really questioning, what are we doing? And maybe it has everything to do with the impact she wants to make. Maybe she is asking about things that are going to be more compassionate towards who she perceives to be underserved or marginalized. And we're not hearing that. And that's extremely important to her. Mm-hmm. We have to begin to hear it. But we don't want to be told by that young millennial that, we're cold and crass and, lack compassion. And so that is why I will say oftentimes having someone come in, which, again, I can get off on all of these little tangents, but
Yep.
the investment that these groups make in professional development is critical.
Yes.
And we put so much time and money and resources towards CE, continuing education. Most
Yep.
of that is academic, clinical, and technical based.
Yep.
We are not putting enough time, money, and resources toward professional development focused on us being human beings rather than human doings.
Yep.
And so, we're not here just to do the things. We are here to be human. And most of the amazing people that we get to share lives with in and around veterinary medicine, they're here not because they love people. Let's remember that. They are here because they love animals. And people come along with that. And so we have to learn the skills that help us to communicate. How good are we at listening? How good are we at shutting our mouth and observing? And, there are 4 levels of listening I love to get into. Maybe we'll do another podcast on listening, Melody, right? But, active and empathetic listening, are we practicing those kinds of behaviors? And if we're not, it probably means that we are not focused on becoming better me. My job is to become a better Jodi today than I was yesterday. And I can only do that by really focusing on my own normal and natural behavioral styles. So even beyond generations, I love to talk about DISC. There are many of those kind of assessments out there, whether you want to talk about DISC or you want to talk about working genius, or there are a handful of them. But the more we commit to learning about ourselves from a professional development perspective, the more able we are to have that courageous conversation as in your scenario, millennial veterinarian who is not feeling seen, heard, and understood. I don't want to go to that Gen X leader and say, you're not, you can't, you won't. Like, those aren't the statements that create a collaborative communication. It is, I really want to make an impact here, and I'd like to have more time with you to improve our teamwork, to improve our professional relationship, because it's really important to me feeling like you do care who I am and what I do, and that you do care, how I feel when I'm here. So, can we have those courageous conversations?
Jodi, I absolutely loved that your first response, and just how you would coach this millennial associate was, think about how you can make it better. Exactly as you just said. It's not about, the Gen Xer is going to be like this and they're always like this. Your whole conversation really focused on, okay, this is the challenge that you're having. And as Rob always sort of repeats, is you can't make other people do things.
Yes.
And so how do you manage yourself and the situation? I think also this discussion of having that third party coach, I 100% agree with you. Sort of the more time I've, just through my veterinary experience, in clinic experience, running teams within the animal health corporate world, realizing how much just a third party coach that is outside of your business but is there to support your people is so important. Because we don't, you tend to promote people into people management roles, and it's like, okay, take this weekend course, or even just take this 8-week program and you'll be good. But I think the challenge I see is sometimes these clinic teams, because they've never had a culture of having these conversations, they just the simple day-to-day conflicts or just challenges that come up, they don't know how to talk about it.
Right.
Yes. And so it's not ingrained in them. Just the simple humaning, having, like you said, a respectful conversation that doesn't need to be combative. And I think that's the key.
Yeah, so. I agree. And I think that's the really important part, that training, and Rob talks about this, training is different than mentorship, is different than coaching. And we do all this training and we do all this CE and it's like one and done. We can't do it that way anymore, period. Like, I will put a period at the end of that sentence. If you're still doing it that way, if you think it's still going to be effective for you to create culture and to attract talent and retain talent, and you are not going to invest in your people on an ongoing, and I'll say at a minimum 4 times a year, we're starting to get there. If you are not willing to do that for your people, you are part of the problem and not part of the solution.
Agreed. All right.
There's my Gen X, like
get her done.
Direct. Yes, that's right. Like,
I think that was your mic drop moment.
That's right.
So on that note, let's just leave it there.
Okay.
Amazing.
Jodi,
thanks, Jodi. Have a great day.
Appreciate you. Have an awesome day.
Bye. If you saw yourself as that associate millennial veterinarian that was not feeling seen or understood, take a step back and ask yourself, what can I do to have a courageous conversation? That probably struck me as being, wow, this is really not about how I can change the other person and make them see my way. This really was about self-reflection and thinking about, what do I have control over in this particular situation? And what do I have to do? What do I have to do to make sure that it's not a combative conversation, that it's not a rushed conversation? And really, this boils down to me when talking with Jodi here about forming relationships with the person that you're working with. And I'm not talking about superficial doing relationships, like you work really well together, you do really well in surgery together or handing cases off. This is genuinely about understanding and listening to the other person to get their perspective. And that builds bridges to have more difficult conversations, if you will, or scenarios where you're needing to work through problem solving. And again, I love Jodi's suggestion of, if you're wanting to have these conversations and build bridges, maybe you have to look at having them outside of work hours. Maybe you have to look at having them outside the clinic venue and just having a quieter moment where you can actually connect. The other piece that I think I really appreciated here was, as a clinic, we really need to focus on the people as the foundation of the pyramid. Because again, we're really good at the academic and the technical, all the doing and the tasks. But if you don't have a solid foundation of people and people working together, people being just human beings together, you can't really build a high performing team on top of that. So that investment in people development, people communication, people coaching is so important. Hopefully you found this little scenario helpful. Thanks for listening. Until next time.